But welcome to today's LEAD exclusive session, where we'll have an opportunity to hear about the book 25 Million Sparks, the Untold Story of Refugee Entrepreneurs from the author of the book himself, Andrew Leon Hanna. Now, you'll have an opportunity to hear a bit more about Andrew in a moment, but as we get started, just wanted to take a second and embarrass Andrew a little bit and share with all of you that he actually graduated with the MBA class, GSB MBA class of 2022 just this past weekend. And so I just wanted to take a moment and share warm congratulations with him on behalf of our community. So I welcome you to unmute and join me in doing that. Congratulations, Andrew.
Congratulations.
Huge achievement.
I appreciate it.
Good job. Good job.
Well, everyone, as promised, following the session, we're going to do a random drawing and give a few of you that are here with us a free copy of 25 Million Sparks. So look out for the winners to be announced in Workplace when we post this recording. And of course, if you win, we'll send you an email as well, and you'll get your copy of this wonderful book that we're going to hear about. And it's also my pleasure to introduce all of you to our wonderful moderator today, someone that many of you know well through your engagement in the LEAD community, Deepti Pahwa. Deepti is part of the LEAD exponent cohort, completed the certificate in 2020, and she remains engaged with the program as a course facilitator and is also actively involved in a number of community engagements. She's one of the founding partners and driving forces behind LISA, which is the LEAD Incubator and Startup Accelerator. So we're so delighted to have her bring her passion and dedication to supporting entrepreneurs to today's conversation. So Deepti, thank you so much for being here. I will turn it over to you for the rest of the session.
Thank you, Marine, for that kind introduction. That really sets up the scene for the talking about entrepreneurship today. Welcome, everyone. Always a pleasure to be part of super energizing sessions here at LEAD Community. This is a fireside chat format, very informal, like all LEAD community events, where I'll be speaking to Andrew with a few questions, but everyone in the audience is most welcome to add questions to the chat, and we'll be taking audience questions in the end. As Marine already introduced, today we have an awesome session ahead of us highlighting the book 25 Million Sparks, the Untold Story of Refugee Entrepreneurs, which is a powerful story of hope and discovers humanity at its best. And we have here with us today the author of the book, Andrew Leon Hanna. Introducing Andrew Hanna is, in a few words, is really very difficult, but I will try my best. Andrew is a first-generation Egyptian-American lawyer, entrepreneur, and author from Jacksonville, Florida. He's the award-winning author of 25 Million Sparks, the book that we're going to talk about today, for which he also won the Financial Times Brackenbauer Prize in London. Andrew is founder of 3 ventures aimed at supporting underrepresented entrepreneurs: DreamX America, Immigrant Love, and Sava. As head of DreamX America, which was honored on Fast Company's 2021 World Changing Ideas list, he has connected small businesses to about $300,000 in zero-interest loans during the COVID-19 pandemic. He's also a Knight Hennessy Scholar and Siebel Scholar at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And Andrew has also been named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list and graduated with honors from Howard Law School, where he was an editor of the Harvard Law Review. Andrew, congratulations on this book, 25 Million Sparks, and of course, congratulations on graduating this weekend as well. I just finished reading your book this weekend and super inspired by this captivating, human-centered narration of the stories of refugee entrepreneurs. To get started, we would love to get an introduction of the book in your own words. That'll be amazing.
Definitely. Thank you so much to everyone who had a part in organizing this. And thank you, Deepti and Marina. Really honored to be here and appreciate everything that you've provided, the space to talk, and also just amazed already about how engaged and excited this community is and how dispersed across the world it is. So really honored to be here. Yeah, so 25 Million Sparks is, and also thank you for the congratulations. So 25 Million Sparks is a book about refugee entrepreneurs around the world. And it's meant to tell of the power, beauty, dignity, and creativity of refugees throughout the world. And it starts by taking a window into the lives of 3 Syrian women entrepreneurs in the Zatri refugee camp in Jordan. One is named Esma, who is a storyteller in the Zatri camp, and she brings together kids to encourage them through reading stories and educational activities. Another one is Yasmina, who was a wedding shop owner and salon owner in Syria, and then started a new shop in the Zatri camp, and has just an incredibly beautiful shop with dresses of all kinds of colors in it that you'll see if you were to go there, and a salon where she kind of helps brides and grooms celebrate within the camp. It's sometimes something that you may not expect, that these things continue to camp, but as she says, life goes on, and there's a time for happiness and a time for sadness. And so she helps remind people of their beauty and celebrate celebratory moments in the camp. And then there's Melek, who is a younger artist in the camp, who often her art focuses on human rights and issues related to women's and girls' education and violence against women and girls. And she advocates for a lot of these issues while helping the kids through expressing their views and beliefs through art. And so these 3 women, we kind of follow their lives, and then it zooms out and talks about 20 camps and cities around the world, from Utica, New York, to Yorkshire, England, Egypt, Jordan, all kinds of places where refugees have settled. And the main kind of point and takeaway is again, to tell the beauty, dignity, and power and creativity of refugees, but then also to make a call to say, this is a moral issue, that there are 30 million plus refugees in the world, and 99% are not formally resettled. And it's an economic issue because refugees bring significant economic value to our communities. And so it's both morally and economically not wise to shirk our responsibility to welcome them. And so that's kind of where it all starts.
Indeed, indeed. Your book transported me actually to the Safari refugee camp. I felt like I was there, and hearing the stories of these women were more like I actually know them, because you've put them together so well. It was so real and so human. And what was very interesting about this was also how you explored the broader refugee entrepreneurship phenomenon. But one thing I was really curious about is, what was your inspiration in writing this book?
Definitely. So I started writing it in 2018, when I think there was a lot of talk at the time about the asylum seekers fleeing Central America to come across the border to the U.S. Donald Trump was president at the time. As I'll make a point throughout this talk, I actually don't think it's a political thing. I think there should be a lot of unity across religions and political beliefs in welcoming refugees. But Trump was particularly insidious about the way he talked about, particularly people of color who were immigrants and refugees around the world. And so the way that rhetoric came up, there was, conversation about not welcoming people from S-hole countries. My mom told me not to curse, so I'm not going to curse, but, and so all of this kind of rhetoric, and then actually also on the other side of the spectrum, there was another way of framing refugees that I also felt uncomfortable with, and that was more of the victim narrative. And so the way I kind of saw things was, there's a victim and a villain narrative about refugees, but there isn't somebody telling a fuller story. And so what I mean by that is, the victim narrative is much more, we need to help these folks because they don't have any agency of their own, and they're kind of pitiful beings. And I think it's usually unintentional, but that's kind of how it comes across. You can think of some of the charity and nonprofit ads that we've seen in the past, where it's just kind of very sad images meant to evoke sympathy. And I think that's coming from a good place because they want to raise money, but it often is quite dehumanizing. And then the villain narrative is what we talked about a little bit with the Trump administration, which is a little bit, they're going to come take our jobs, or they're not going to contribute. They're going to, commit crimes. And so all of this was going on, and I felt like both sides of the spectrum and the media and politicians just didn't give a full enough view of the voice of refugees on the ground, which is true of really all forgotten communities. They're kind of media and politicians and others kind of have a cloud of buzzwords about them, but they often don't get to have their stories told in a more authentic way. And so I wanted to do that. I wanted to kind of take the cloud of political buzzwords away and just say, hey, these are 3 women living in this camp. This isn't about politics. This isn't about anything else. It's about their lives, and it's about celebrating their incredible resilience. It's about talking about their pain and the unbelievable suffering in Syria and the fact that half of the country was displaced, but then celebrating their power and creativity and what they've done to turn the camp, which it's, at first was a settlement in a desert with, not much, but helping turn that into a place that is at least more livable, still not where anybody should live, but at least more livable because of their ingenuity. And then I wanted to, zoom out further and talk about the broader crisis and the fact that there's more refugees in the world today than ever before, or more displaced people than ever before. And we all owe a responsibility as countries and as local communities to welcome refugees and to invest in them, because they have a lot to offer us.
Right. I mean, this is particularly what I really liked about your stories, how you show the creativity and entrepreneurship in a very different light as we know it, and the strength of this human spirit to turn even the most difficult adversity into an opportunity. Maybe a question in between, which is a follow-up, a sort of, I know you were an immigrant yourself, or born to immigrant parents. Does that kind of also inspire you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah. My parents were born and raised in Egypt. So they are the most inspiring people I've ever met. And so they really, created opportunities for me in a way that I never could have imagined. My dad grew up in a small village in Egypt. And nobody there really spoke English or went to high school usually. And so he had a totally different vision of his life than what other people kind of expected of him. And he kind of pursued that with a lot of creativity and passion, and had a lot of help along the way from critical people. And he became a primary care doctor in the U.S. and changed the lives of hundreds and if not thousands of patients in my hometown in Florida, Jacksonville. And my mom was a preschool teacher, and she contributed, basically was one of the just such an amazing light in the lives of kids across the camp. And in some ways I saw some of what Esma was doing. I saw some parallels there, although in a very different setting, Florida versus the Zetri camp. And so for me, just growing up, seeing the way that they impacted my home community, immigrant is a different category of migrant in the sense that they thankfully were not forced out of their country through war or violence, but sort of chose to come to the U.S. But similar in the sense that I think immigrants and refugees are often cast in these sort of victim film narratives. And so for me, it was hard to square the beauty that I saw with my parents' story and all of the people I work with through my different ventures, and the lack of reflection of that beauty in what I see in TV shows and media from certain politicians. So yeah, definitely my own experience was a big part of it.
Interesting. Being an immigrant myself, I could also resonate to a lot of the things that you talk about.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Yet another thing that was extremely beautiful about your book, that you were never talking about your thoughts on people's stories. Instead, you were just kind of, I don't know how to put it, maybe amplifying the voices and the narrative of your protagonists. And you've employed some very unique storytelling approaches and principles in its writing. Can you elaborate a bit on the style of writing and techniques you've used here?
Yeah, you actually said it. I'm really glad that you said that, because that's exactly the goal. And that was the main kind of style that I was hoping to employ. For me, which is a voice-driven, I think I tend to call it a voice-driven kind of narrative, which is basically, rather than me opine on my thoughts on what it's like to the lives of these folks in a camp that I would never understand in a million years, what it's like to flee flee my home in Syria with, family members who passed away, with house burned down as Esma's house was burned down, fleeing while pregnant as Yasmina did, going from, a big house, many of them had very comfortable lives, to a tent in the heat with, without adequate food rations. So I would never understand that just by talking with them. And so that was kind of the reasoning for saying, okay, how can I write something that centers on their quotes? And so I sort of started with their quotes and then built the narrative around that and tried to just make it so that their voices could be as clear as possible, even to a point where we did broader like creative collaboration. And so Melik's art is in the book, as you saw, in different parts, and that kind of helps explain her way of seeing the world. And then Esma's poetry is the way the book ends. And so it's a bit of a creative collaboration in that sense too. And then the other thing, the other element that I tried to adhere to is not letting the ugliness of the system and the situation detract from the beauty of the people. And so I think too often any kind of crisis or bad situation, we conflate as like, and just naturally, I think, and it doesn't help again with media environment and things like that, but conflate like, okay, refugee crisis, Esma's a victim of the refugee crisis. And so we forget to see her and say, oh, wait a second, she's actually an incredible human being, an equal human being, most importantly. And this could have happened to any of us. It's just she's surrounded by all of these other issues and clouded by these other words. And so I wanted to not undermine the seriousness of the situation. So that's why the first part of the book, of the 4 parts, is called Darkness. And then it gets to Spark, is to say, okay, this is, just nail down very clearly, this is the greatest refugee crisis in history. What happened in Syria is unbelievable. And the fact that it hasn't been covered is a failure of the global community. And the camp is a really, difficult place to be. But these folks have made it so much more tolerable and so much more better, and so much more with more life because of their abilities and their skills. And so there was this element of don't take away from the seriousness and the sadness of the situation, but then use that to talk about their resilience and power, and don't let the story just end there, because that's often where the story ends.
Yeah, I love the titles that you used in the book. I mean, you talk about Darkness and Spark. I really particularly like how you kind of bring about the boldness and audacity of each of these women. And one of my favorite chapters was Balloon, where the Yasmin, she's talking about how she was fueling a bit of a movement where no one ever thought of having a celebration, of a wedding or a high-end wedding. Or Malak talks about, my model of myself. My model is myself. I don't want to follow
Yeah.
anybody's good art. And also the Asma, like how she's talking about the storytelling for children and bringing hope and vision. Um, that makes for a perfect segue for maybe my next question, talking about boldness and audacity. Based on your research, what makes refugees so much more entrepreneurial than others? And also, what are some of the unique barriers that they face?
Definitely. Yeah, I like that chapter as well, because the reason it's called Balloons is at the end. I'll just tell this quick story. Esma, when she first came to the camp and said, I want to do this storytelling. First of all, she, fled. Her house was burned to the ground. She suffered a miscarriage early in her time there in the camp, or in Jordan broadly, partly because of a lack of healthcare access. And so she was really at her lowest point. And she told me that sort of fueled a desire to create opportunities for the kids in the camp, because she had 2 kids. She wanted all of the ones who were there to feel a sense of encouragement, and a sense of they could do something in their lives beyond just talking about war and violence and disaster. It was kind of the common kind of words that were spread out there. And so she essentially started the first time she did an activity, it was she asked kids to write anything. First of all, she had to chase kids in the camp to get them to come, because initially, kids had to work to help their parents, or they had sort of given up on education a bit for a while because there wasn't education in the early days in the camp. So she's sitting there chasing kids around the camp to try to get them to come to the trailer to do a story. She would give people books so that they would return them. And then she did one activity. The first activity was sort of just draw anything that you want to draw, anything that's in your mind or in your heart. And she was very saddened because it was often pictures of war and violence and troops and things like that, army planes. And so for the next year or so, she started the program. She would read books and write her own books that focused on more empowering stories. Like, for example, a book called Airplanes Spread Love that is actually meant to turn its head on rather than being somebody who's going to be involved in war, I'm going to spread love. And then she did this activity with balloons. And she told everyone a year later to draw with marker on the balloons whatever was in their hearts. So similar prompt. And instead it was things like love and people holding hands and flowers and trees and things like that. And then she told them all to go outside in the camp and blow up the balloons and then send them off to Syria. So that was a really nice moment that she told me about. And it was an honor to kind of watch her do storytelling, because she's so empowering and so caring of the kids. And now that I've told the story, I've completely forgot your question. Oh yeah, the barriers. And so I'll start with the barriers. There a lot of them are somewhat obvious, but a lot of them are like way deeper than people think. And so you would guess language barriers, but then also so having to learn a whole new language often tech barriers if the place where you're coming from didn't have the same kind of tech requirements or tech accessibility. Access to capital is a huge one. And so it's both not having savings often coming to the camp. In the case of Esma, Melik, and Yasmina, all of them were very comfortable in Syria, but they all had to flee pretty quickly. And so, Yasmina just had a bunch of basically trash bags in the back of a pickup truck. And so lack of savings, and she had to sell her wedding jewelry in order to start her business. And so that was both personally meaningful and economically meaningful. And so lack of savings, but then also lack of access to loans and investments. And so it's one thing interesting being at Stanford where there's so much money flowing around. But then at the same time, a lot of my work with DreamX America, one of the organizations I lead, is helping get zero interest loans to immigrant entrepreneurs. And so we're talking about millions of dollars of VC money over here, but then over here it's just a $7,000 loan or a $2,000 loan to keep immigrant entrepreneurs afloat who are doing really amazing work. And 50% of the people, or no, actually, I think it was maybe even higher, said that they definitely would. I think it was 80% said that they wouldn't have gotten a loan otherwise. 50% said that they would have closed if they didn't get a loan. And so that just goes to show you these are real businesses making a real impact, but they don't have the relationships with banks or networks to get access to loans quickly. And we saw that during the COVID loan distribution as well, PPP. So lack of access to capital and lack of credit that helps with that because they just moved. There's also issues with refugees not having work permits and different country policies. There's trauma from having fled, which it should not be understated, and the mental health challenges of that. Yasmina is trying to run a business while calling back in Syria and learning about what's going on with her family that was still there. And a few other barriers, but yeah, just a significant amount of challenges to overcome for refugees. But that's what makes it even more surprising maybe, and even more amazing that refugees are 1.5 to 2x more entrepreneurial than the average citizen. There's a study that the US government did that showed that they had a $63 billion net fiscal impact over a 10-year period, over and above what it costs to resettle or anything like that. And part of that is because they have 5 or 6 advantages. So one is resilience. And so that's essentially, we always celebrate the resilience of people in Silicon Valley and others. This is like the most time, the most resilience. This is like resilience of I had, family members who died, or in the case of one woman I interviewed, Iman, she had her leg, amputated because of an explosion in camp, and still is innovating and working and for accessibility of others in the camp. And so you have people with disabilities, mental and physical, because of the place that they fled from. And you have all kinds of obstacles that are, of the most intense that one can imagine. And so being able to be resilient through that makes being able to be resilient through a downturn in your business, or not getting the loan you needed, or whatever it is, much easier, because they have that perspective. Commitment level is the second one. And so I talked about Yasmina selling her wedding jewelry. Part of that was, there was no choice but to go forward at that point. Often entrepreneurs who are celebrated tend to have backup options. And so it's really not that crazy of a risk that they took, because at the end of the day, they could probably get another job. With Yasmina and with others, this was it. And so there's a 100% commitment, and there's no backing off of that. And that's something we could learn from as well. And then there's a cross-cultural advantage. And so some reviews and some studies have shown that when students, for example, study abroad, they come back and they have better business ideas. And when people who are migrants tap into their intercultural experiences, they come up with better business ideas, because they've been exposed to other markets, other customers, other ways of thinking. And so there's this kind of cross-cultural advantage. And Melek is an example of that, because her art had this kind of Syrian flair to it. And so that's this kind of cross-cultural access is really important. And again, something that is important, why it's important to have diversity in institutions. There's a million reasons, but that's one, is that you're able to see things from another lens that can be quite powerful. And then another one is empathy. So this is one that I kind of didn't do any scientific studies on, but it's something that I noticed quite a bit through my work, which is when I have the loan applications out, for example, with DreamX America, almost every application starts with this selfless attitude of, I did this business because I want to help my community, or I want to bring my community together. I want to find a home in my community. And so I've just seen so much that refugees, having fled, not having many people. Another barrier I didn't mention is lack of networks, so just not knowing people in the place. They want to build a community and a home. And so that creates a bit of a higher degree of empathy from what I've seen of, I really want to create a place where people can come, whether if it's a restaurant or whatever it is, or I want to help the people in my community, whether they're similarly migrants or they're native born citizens. And so that's another element. Esma is a good example of that, just a deep empathy for the kids that led her to start this kind of social venture. And I'll say one more example of the cross-cultural venture or advantage, which is Razan, who is a refugee from Syria who went to Yorkshire, England, started a really beautiful cheese company where she was able to see the advantages of British milk in a way that would create this kind of squeaky halloumi cheese that's common in the Middle East and in Syria. And so because she knew about this kind of cheese, and she was able to see something in the milk in Britain that maybe the native born citizens couldn't see, that would create a company that would then quickly, with just 2,500 pounds of a loan, create 100K in revenue, or 100K pounds in revenue, employ many native born citizens. And so that's just one example. So there's immense barriers, but overcome by these kind of immense advantages.
Absolutely amazing. I mean, immense barriers, of course, but I think what you primarily talk about is the power of purpose, right? As well as, of course, the story of resilience and bootstrapping your business and all the things that we here in Silicon Valley can learn from, for sure. And I think one of the messages you already talked about in the beginning of the session is that about the economic value, they create by being entrepreneurial, as well as the common perception of these refugees being a burden on the society, whereas they're actually being a part of, contributing. Given that background, I mean, when I read your book, I was really curious about understanding is, of course, you would want your book to have a very wide reach, but When you were writing this book, who were you hoping would read this book, and what did you want them to be the biggest to have the biggest takeaway as?
Yeah, it's a great question. I definitely wanted all kinds of folks to read it, like you said, but I think probably the category that I cared most about or that I tried to write at most to was people who maybe haven't had experience with refugee or immigrant communities much. And one survey I quote near the end of the book is that over 50% of Americans polled a few years ago said that they would prefer or they would not want to welcome any Syrians, or they would only want to welcome Christians and not Muslims. Obviously, both groups are suffering quite a bit, but if by saying only Christians, you're excluding most Syrians. And so, in one kind of side note, I sent Melek the book. She's pretty good at English, and so she was able to read it, and she said she loved it, and she was hoping it would inspire more women and refugee women and others. But she said one thing that made her really sad was that statistic, because she said, why would people think like this? We did not choose this life, is what she said. And so what I'm hoping is that people who maybe would have clicked, yes, I don't want to welcome any Syrians in that survey would read this book and realize maybe I just was kind of blindly following what my political affiliation or my brother or my parents or what I heard in the media, or maybe I didn't have a full understanding of what I was saying yes to, and that maybe they could, by seeing that human relationship, saying, oh, this could have easily been me. It could have been me in a war, that started, and then I had to flee to Mexico, and then I crossed the border, and then I was in a camp suddenly. Like, this could happen to any human being. It just happens to be where you grew up and what happened in your lifetime. And so my hope is that people can resonate and see themselves in those stories and realize that we're closer together than we maybe thought. And then act in a way that will welcome people in their local communities who are fleeing disaster or immigrants more broadly, and will hopefully vote and affect policy in a way that will ensure that we welcome more refugees into our countries and provide support, both for the moral reason and for the self-interested economic reason.
Great. I mean, definitely, I think your book has the power to change narrative and the power to change perspective. I think such a perfect timing also with the Ukrainian crisis, right? Given what is the current state of refugee crisis according to you, especially given the invasion of Ukraine, and what can we do to help, in your opinion?
Definitely. Yeah. And so the question earlier, I don't know, I'm forgetting if it's Jaloni or Jalone. Okay.
Jaloni.
Jaloni. Okay.
Jaloni, yeah.
You asked the question, why the title 25 Million Sparks? And so the reason was, when I started writing the book in 2018, there were 25 million refugees. And so the idea is that all of them are sparks of light and creativity. Sadly, when I sent the book to press through the publisher, Cambridge, it was just about a year and a half ago or so, it was 26.4 million. And now the refugee crisis in in Ukraine is now, last time I checked, 6 million refugees. And so well over 30 now, which is quite tragic and terrible. And now actually just hit the mark of 200 million displaced. Displaced meaning you either fled out of the country and are a refugee, or fled within the country. And so, as I mentioned, Syria, for example, half the country is displaced in some way. And so the situation is, it's the greatest global refugee crisis, the most number of refugees in the world history. It already was, and now it's much worse because of the tragic events in Ukraine. And so, the key kind of what we can do, I think, is first and foremost is just kind of tracing the path. Like, the first is that there shouldn't have been some of these violent acts and invasions and all this other stuff. And so that's a bigger geopolitical issue, but recognizing that not being able to control these things is leading to a bunch of people who had nothing to do with the geopolitics having their entire lives ruined or lost because of it. And so the importance of maintaining order and maintaining kind of respect for human rights in different places around the world is first. And then once they do flee, once those things do happen, there's the statistic I shared earlier: less than 1% of refugees around the world are formally resettled by the UN. And so what that means is that most refugees are living in transitory lives, either in camps or host cities. They're not permanently resettled and given like a real full chance to restart their lives. And the reason for that is that it's like an optional program the UN started after World War II. And so about 30 to 40 nations partake in the program, but many don't. And so each country that partakes, like the US, needs to do more, needs to welcome more refugees, and more countries need to partake in it as well. And the US used to be a leader, and I think under the previous administration dropped significantly. Even under the current administration, it had to be sort of cajoled to welcome more refugees. Refugees often are just sort of not a political priority, and they kind of, and so that's one issue. And so pushing our kind of leaders and elected leaders to make that a priority and to prioritize welcoming refugees is critical. Another is storytelling and just kind of setting the record straight on what refugees are and who they are and what it means to invest in them. I think because, this is why I wrote the book in many ways, because refugees are often portrayed in this way, a victim or villain, it's either a feeling of I don't want to welcome them at all, or I want to welcome them, but it's going to be a burden, and I'm doing it purely for charity reasons, and but rather it should become a shift in saying, not only is this valuable as a moral reason, it's also incredibly economically valuable. And people have seen this, and like there are examples all over the world. And Port Adelaide, Australia was revitalized by bringing in Hazara refugees from Afghanistan. Utica, New York, and other Rust Belt cities in the US that were completely declining because of factory closures brought in refugees who revitalized the cities. And it actually became a thing that mayors would do is try to campaign to be the place that refugees are resettled in the US. So it's happening and it's true. It's just not a narrative that goes out as much. And so voters don't tend to believe it as much. And so then politicians don't feel accountable to it. And often they'll shy away from this stuff during general elections, for example. And so shifting the narrative is really important. And particularly migrants of color from places like the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, who are sometimes put in another class. And so we've seen some of that with the different media coverage with Ukraine versus Syria, for example, when in reality, all of them should be covered in the media much more. And then the last thing is just local community. So anywhere that you are, there are probably refugees or immigrants who are there, and there's probably a welcoming center or a refugee resettlement center there, providing money if you can, providing volunteer services, providing help finding housing. A lot of faith groups will actually make sure that any refugee in their community has an apartment and a place to live and language training. You can give on DreamX America partners with Kiva, which is a micro lending platform that you can give loans to, and you can filter by refugees and immigrants. If you work at a company, there's staffing agencies that work for, or run a company, there's staffing agencies that work to help refugees, particularly find refugees for your company. There's one called Amplio in the US, and I'm sure there's others around the world. And so prioritizing hiring refugees. The one element I hadn't mentioned in terms of barriers is discrimination. And a lot of or one part of why refugees and immigrants will start businesses is that they weren't able to find a job because their credentials weren't appropriately credited. And so making sure that your company, whether you run it or are a part of it, is held accountable on that. Those are kind of the main ones. And I can't emphasize enough some of these aid organizations and resettlement organizations, because they're on the front lines in the refugee camp or in the local community, and providing support for them is really critical. And so if you can do that financially or with your company or with your time, it would go a long way. And even just the personal relationship goes a long way. One person I talked to named Baliga, who's from Yemen, and she lives in Utica, New York, just the encouragement, just having people say you belong here and you can do what you want here, and we're going to help you, goes a long way. And so the position, putting yourself in a position to do that from a more like personal heart level would go a long way too.
Thanks so much for sharing those insights, and maybe all of us can right now use it given the Ukraine crisis. And I mean, you won the Financial Times Brackenbauer Prize for this book, which is actually given to annual award, which is given to business books, right? So it's so amazing that you were actually able to kind of balance the human centricity and the human storytelling as well as the the business side of this entire issue. Thank you so much, Andrew, for sharing the insights on the book. We would love for you to read an excerpt from your book, if you'd like to share with our LEAD community. And in the meanwhile, I would just request the audience to, I see a couple of questions here. There are 2 questions which we are going to take after Andrew reads his excerpt. Yeah.
Sure. And I'm going to read from chapter 1 on, it's introducing Esma to the reader. Okay. It's kind of fun reading it online to folks. I hope you enjoy it. Okay. Sitting alone in the center of her trailer on a chocolate-colored cushion resting atop the chocolate-colored carpet, Esma looks down at a children's book. Her soft brown eyes dart across page after page in sheer concentration. It was a quick rehearsal for the performance to come. A rare moment of silence in trailer 6.4, District 8, Zetri. Suddenly, without a word from Esma, the trailer around her is transformed. Children's laughter and stomping against the dirt outside grows louder and louder until the trailer walls shake slightly. The wooden door creaks open. 5 young boys take off their shoes and dive into the open space in front of Esma, as is their weekly ritual. Her living room had become a magical escape for them. Ahlan wa sahlan ya Sami. Welcome, Sammy. Esma greets each of them, her face having instantaneously switched from focus to a smile. If Yasmina's smile is wise and Malak's is eager, Esma's is soft and infectiously joyful. More and more children pour in, and last through the door are 2 of Esma's favorite students, her eldest daughters, Tamara and Maya. Tamara is shorter, older, and gentler, while Maya is taller, younger, and more playfully mischievous. Returning from Taekwondo practice, they're wearing matching white uniforms with yellow belts. They quickly say their hellos and head to the back room, re-emerging in matching ruby dresses with big ruby bows in their hair. They take turns giving Esma a hug before sitting cross-legged with their friends. It's time to begin. Yalla ya shabab. Come on, children. With 3 words, as if Esma possesses a supernatural gravitational pull, the children gather to sit in a more organized circle surrounding her. She grabs a hold of her baby boy, Muhammad, and puts him firmly in her lap as she reaches over him to turn to the first page. The magic begins. This story is about a conversation between a boy named Samer and his mom. It is called A Plane That Brings Love. Esma's voice rises and falls as she reads the story with the passion of a once-in-a-lifetime audition. The children concentrate, spellbound by her performance, immersed in a world far removed from the Zatri heat. At each page, Esma smoothly rotates the book towards the kids so they can enjoy the illustrations accompanying the dialogue. Mom, I want to drive an army airplane when I grow up, Samer says. Tamara suddenly stands and scurries to the kitchen. She returns with a water jug and glasses for the group. Always a gracious host. Esma continues, but I will be a pilot of love, not war. I will draw red hearts and spread them everywhere from my plane. I will spread happiness, love, hope, and peace, so the little boys and girls can play in peace. so the birds flying around can sing in peace. Upon reaching the final page, she holds up the book to show a cartoon illustration of a boy with brown aviator goggles parachuting down onto the Syrian hills as his mom waits for him with open arms. His parachute is in the form of a red heart with the word love, or hub, labeled on it in 3 places. Yes, I will be a pilot of love, not war, so my country will be more beautiful, a country of hope, happiness, love, and peace. For a second or two, the words hang in the air. Esma closes the book. El Nihaya, the end. In an instant, the spell is lifted. The kids graciously thank Esma and begin to gather their things and leave, playfully pushing one another on their way out. In the moments after their departure, as their laughter fades in the distance, Esma is alone again for just a few seconds. She thinks back to when she was a girl 2 decades ago in the town of Darat and what her education meant to her, how she would sleep in her school uniform because she was so excited for the next day, how she dreamt one day she would become a teacher, but worried she lacked the confidence. I loved school, but in class, when the teacher would ask a question and I knew the answer, I would have to wait until at least one other person raised her hand first. Now she is boldly reinventing herself as a social entrepreneur and poet, leading a storytelling initiative that is expanding throughout Zatri. I want every girl to complete her education. Everyone should fulfill her dream. In that brief moment of quiet, Esma looks up and whispers a prayer of thanks for the chance to tashajja, to encourage, to gently uplift children toward the dreams they might otherwise have forgotten.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And that was really one of my favorite excerpts too. On that note, I would invite, the audience here, lead community, to ask their questions. I see that Vanessa has put a very interesting question for you. Vanessa, do you want to raise your question yourself? Would you like to unmute yourself?
I'm happy to jump in.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. This is such a lovely event, and it's lovely to meet you, Andrew. So thanks for being here. And one quick thing before I jump into the question. I love how you're naming all these women, like throughout this engagement. There's just something about how you've presented their stories, and it really shows that they've permeated you and they're stuck with you, which brings me to the question, what inspired you to focus on women, and while immersing yourself into their stories, was there something that completely surprised you, something that you couldn't have predicted?
Thank you so much, Vanessa. The kind words mean a lot. And yeah, it's a great question. I think I wasn't intentional at first. When I went to the camp, I worked with Save the Children Jordan, the organization that works in the camp there, and they introduced me to a lot of people, and so a lot of their stories are there. But those 3 people in particular stood out the most to me. I just felt more of a connection to them. And I think part of it is that women have an extra set of burdens as refugees, an extra set of discriminatory elements, an extra set of, Yasmina was pregnant when she was fleeing, an extra set of societal elements of, being entrepreneurs can be pushing against sometimes the norms. And so I think there was something even more powerful with their stories because of those elements. And so I think that's why I ended up focusing on 3 women. And then when I do the other examples, I try to bring in a diversity of folks. But I just felt like their stories were really powerful. I also wanted to, maybe there was an element, I actually don't think this was why I did it, but I was happy about it for another reason, which is I think sometimes the Middle East is portrayed in ways that can be unfair about, I don't think Middle Eastern women are propped up the way that they should be, and celebrated. And so I thought that was kind of a nice byproduct of it. We through Cambridge, my publisher, I didn't know what Harper's Bazaar was until recently, but it's the kind of a fashion magazine. So they published an article about Esma, which I thought was really cool. And so the more that these folks' work can be. And there's going to be a film coming out about Esma that actually had nothing to do with that I learned about recently. And so I kind of like the idea that their stories will be highlighted in a way that they normally are not.
Thank you, Vanessa, for asking that very insightful question. I see Jalon has another question for you. She had two questions, but one you've already answered. And everybody else, please put in your questions here or raise your hand. I mean, we'll take the questions, as many as we can. So Jalon.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. It would be interesting to know, in your course of interacting with the women, interviewing them, what did you find out was the motivating factor? What drove them? What made them become unique to want to be away from the pack and do something differently, to see the light in the dark, if you will?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think what's interesting is, even though Yasmina, Melek, and Esma are really exceptional in a million ways, their stories aren't actually very unique in the sense that everyone I met was doing that in their own way, was sort of resilient and courageous and creative in their own ways. Some, a lot of them were own entrepreneurs. A lot of them were doing other things in the camp, like volunteering in certain ways. And so there's something about, I think there's something about just having been forced to flee home and find a new home and create a new home out of nothing and deal with all of those challenges that hardens folks in a way that says, well, you have to have something, you have to have some kind of hope or belief that there's a reason for what happened. And so for a lot of folks I talked with, it was faith. And Iman was somebody who talked a lot about her faith. Yasmina said, I asked her at one point, there are other wedding shops that have popped up as well. She was one of the earlier ones, but I said, how do you think about competition and things like that, which, very common question if you were talking to a business in the US, for example. And she sort of laughed and said, like, I believe that God will kind of give to each person what they need and what they deserve, or what they, God will take care of each person, something like that. And so I think there was a lot of faith elements that said, okay, there's a reason I'm here, and let me try to see what the plan for my life is. And I think there's just the fact that they lived through such chaos and disaster and some of the worst moments that anyone could imagine. I think having lived through that brings a lot of confidence, even that you can do other things. And so for Esma, it was particularly interesting because she was able to do things in the camp that she couldn't do back at home. She sort of broke out of roles that she had at home that she was able to do in the camp. It was almost like having hit rock bottom, especially after she lost her child. There was nowhere to go but up. And she also has a lot of kind of faith there as well. So I think it was some combination of those things that made them stand out. But I do want to say it's really not unique to them. It's so many, like everybody I met in the camp, so many stories, millions of stories around the world. The UNHCR covers them pretty well. Like in the Shirkoli camp in Ethiopia, there's a woman named Masika who, created a bread cooperative with like a $17 loan. There's Utica, New York, as I mentioned, there's someone named Chip who fled from Laos and started an app company after living in a church steeple for a few years. And so there's a lot of stories all around the world. And even the ones who aren't entrepreneurs, I use their particular lens of entrepreneurship, but their stories of resilience and finding work to support your family that are really amazing. And so it's not just the exceptional few, it's really all refugees. I mean, all that I've encountered in my work.
So the question then is, thank you for that answer.
Mm-hmm.
Did you zero into these three women, since there's so many people who were creative in the camp? How did you manage to zero in them?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I picked the camp. I wanted to focus on one place because I thought that maybe the narrative would be more compelling. And rather than, I was thinking of doing 3 different places, and it would move from Utica to Zetri to another place. But I ended up picking one place for the narrative purpose. And then I picked Zetri in part because I felt like the Syrian crisis, it's been 10 years now, has been underreported. And there was only one moment, if you all remember, where there was a boy named Aylan who surfaced on the beach from Greece. His boat had been capsized, and it was a child who had drowned. And that's when there was a lot of coverage. There was a lot of donations, but it felt like aside from that, there wasn't much in the last 10, 11 years. And so particularly my parents being from Egypt, I cared a lot about Syria, another kind of Middle Eastern country. And I'd read about Zetri camp being particularly entrepreneurial. A lot of camps have these kind of entrepreneurial movements, but Zetri has 2 main streets with so many businesses, thousands of businesses with actually really significant revenue per month. Forgetting the number, I think 30 million from several years ago when they reported that. And so I had heard a lot about it, wanted to attract more attention to kind of this community that is often portrayed in very discriminatory ways in the US, for example. And I wanted to shine a light on their beauty. And then those 3 women in particular, like I mentioned a bit earlier, I think it was talking with different people and their stories really stood out. And they had a diversity of businesses too. I wanted to include Esma's in particular because it wasn't like, hers is a social venture. It doesn't make any money for the camp, but I kind of wanted to do that on purpose because I wanted to say it's not really about the economics. It's more about them and what they're doing. So the economics is part of the argument, but not all of it. And so Yasmina provides more on like the economic argument, Melek a little bit as well, and then Esma's is different. So it was a diversity, and then also maybe more just personally meeting them and their stories. My mom would translate back in the US, so I would send her the files. And so maybe she, talking with her as well, it just sort of worked out, that way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jelone, for these questions. We can go on and on and on this very insightful topic, but in the spirit of time, I would ask Andrew now maybe to present some closing thoughts.
For sure. Yeah. I think the main closing thought for me is just that I think so many, outside of refugees, I think so many disadvantaged communities are portrayed in one-dimensional ways. And so the more that we can really believe and live out the fact that all of us are equal and are radically equal and have equal dignity and capacity and ability to create beauty in the world, the better. And I think with refugees in particular, I hope that we'll all kind of think through where in my local community can I plug in to make a difference? And how can I push back against any narratives that say that refugees from a certain part of the world or refugees in general are not powerful, beautiful, and creative. And I kind of hope that we'll kind of live that out and share those stories and contribute tangibly to those folks. So that would be my last thought.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts about your book. And the writing certainly opened my eyes to a very different world of entrepreneurship. And I encourage everyone here to buy a copy of his book that will change your perspective as well about refugees and about entrepreneurship. And you are certain to find a new appreciation for a community, which in Andrew's own words is turning unimaginable pain into beautiful reinvention. And thanks to the wonderful LEAD community here for joining in and always being super engaged and participative in these sessions.
Thank you so much, everyone. It means a lot.
Thanks.